I'm doing well. I'm doing well. How
Yeah.
are you doing?
All right. It's still warm here.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be nice, probably close to the end of the month.
How's the political season in New Hampshire?
Well, I'm far enough north that you get a little bit of activity, but it's just not worth it for candidates to spend a lot of time up here because there's just not enough people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's just there's not a lot of people in New Hampshire at all.
Well, I know there's like 1.5 million or something, but they're all kind of concentrated down in Concord and Manchester and by the seacoast. So,
Oh, okay, okay.
so most of the activity goes. They'll usually hike up here once or twice.
So let's get on with it. So
So I
you
want
go ahead.
covered two things. I wanted to talk a little bit about our challenge, and
Okay.
then I wanted to talk a bit about my own ideas because we really didn't even talk about anything that I think the last time. We kind of
Okay.
talked about some general issues. So um, I don't know. Is there something you wanted to go over?
Go for it.
Okay. So uh, I think you've been arguing a lot for a religion-like object in your videos.
What do you mean
So
by a religion-like object?
well, you look at someone like Brett Weinstein and you pick apart his kind of sort of materialist presumptions, and then he kind of comes to an edge and then falls off a cliff, right? And your argument is, well, there's something there. You're falling off, but like it's not just empty space. And I agree with you. I think the religious feeling and the religious sensibility is an integral part of the human experience. So I don't disagree with you on that point. I think what's more interesting to me is I think we live in this moment of change at a profound level. And the question is you know what what specifically is over the cliff? Like what is it specifically in terms of religion that's going to meet our needs? Right? So I think you really need to articulate not just, should we have a religion like object somewhere in our hearts, but specifically, like theologically, why Christianity? And it's not enough just to assert that Christian precepts are sufficient. They are sufficient to a set of problems. You have to say why they're necessary and why they're necessary for criteria that are relevant to our lives, and not just a narrow set of criteria, but criteria from all sorts of people that are struggling. And if you're going to make global metaphysical claims, they have to have global criteria, right? So I guess what I'd like to hear from you is not later is not just an argument for the place of religion in human experience, but specifically, why is given that you're a Christian, why is the Christian story the story for everyone now?
Good. It's good.
I don't want you to answer right now. I want you to think about this because it's not just a off the cuff kind of a thing. I mean, you can talk a bit, but like don't lay it all out for me right now because I wanted to talk about some other things too.
Well, I'm curious. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about Rene Girard's work. Are you at all familiar with his work?
No, I'm not. Who is he?
He was a Frenchman who taught at Stanford for a lot of the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And he had his mimetic theory of desire, which is, you hear that and you say, oh yeah, that's right. People want what other people want. And that's just kind of true. But a lot of his work was about how religion, and I'm speaking religion in general to begin with, how religion helped humanity survive its own violence. And then he saw Judaism and then Christianity as sort of the natural fulfillment of that dynamic. He talked about the scapegoat dynamic, but what was one of the things, the video that I made, not the one that I released today, but the one that I released the day before, I ended with a little bit of Girard's conversation with David Cayley on the CBC. One of the points that Girard makes is that in the West and almost throughout the world.
Hold on, you got to be more specific about what you mean when you say the West.
Okay, in former Christendom, the colonial powers.
We're talking about Western Europe here, not
we're talking about Western and Eastern Europe.
Okay.
In this case.
Okay.
The presumption, the assumed morality was that of limited violence. And he asserts that actually is a result of Christianity, and it has become so embedded in our culture that we can only critique Christianity by using Christianity. But many, like Brett Weinstein, don't realize, and certainly therefore don't acknowledge, that they are actually using Christian standards to critique Christianity and other things as well. And he points this out in conversations with the Islamic world, where Christians will go to Islam and say, driving planes into buildings and killing infidels, that's immoral. And Muslims will look back at them and say, why do you push your religion on us? Because it's your religion that says it's immoral. Now, in the West, this definition of morality has become so pervasive that it's lost its identification with Christianity completely.
Well, but hold on. What about Hinduism and Buddhism? Because there's a strong moral injunction against violence. It's not totalizing, but there's definitely a prohibition against unnecessary violence in both of those religions.
Well, I would say the question is not necessary. The question is, how do you define or validate or justify unnecessary?
If you kill someone, you're going to bear that.
Right.
Of karma. And there's a sort of a celestial force tells you. So yeah, you can go around killing, and it's not like there's you're not going to get struck by a lightning bolt, but you're going to bear the consequences of it. So a wise person will refrain from killing if there's no, you have to eat, okay, but did you have to kill that bug? Well, if it didn't serve some need that you have, and you're not willing to take on the responsibility for the consequences of what you did, then no, you shouldn't. You've gone against the Dharma in that case, right? So there's a strong injunction against violence if it's not motivated by something that is clear in your mind.
So you're saying that this is where do you think this idea comes from?
It doesn't come from Christianity. I'm sorry, the Buddha was not influenced by Christ.
No, I agree with that. But so where does the idea come from?
It comes from the culture. It comes from the cultural sensibility. Hold on, I got to get this. Can we pause for just a second?
Yeah.
I'll be right back. Yeah, it comes out of the cultural sensibility. I mean, it comes out of the feeling of the people that, we have these. I think one thing that's weird about this sort of textualism of Judaic and Christian and Muslim religions is that you get this idea that there's a text and that the text has all the wisdom that humans can access. And, no, I mean, we have these faculties that connect us to the world. And if you look within, there's something there that didn't have anything to do with the book. Like you can apprehend the world, and it's not like the people that wrote the book that had their apprehensions that wrote it down didn't have the same faculties that we have. I mean, there's a question of talent and timing and various other things, but it's not like these people were like a different species.
No, I agree with that. Well,
So yes, where did the prohibition against violence in Buddhism and Buddhism? I mean, it came from, a long tradition that had a genesis somewhere, and there was an idea, and they played that out, and it was very successful. I mean, I know things are in some ways have been a shit show in India for a while, but they did have a lot of their wealth extracted through colonialism, and and now they're facing these environmental problems that are partly due to industrialization. They had a very long, successful civilization, full of wealth, a wealth of experience and beauty and every other thing.
Is there a reason you think they, the colonial period is, I don't know, we might be getting very far afield to where you wanted to talk about, or this might be very much what you wanted to talk about. I don't know. I don't want to.
Well, no, I wanted to go into my theory of consciousness. So
okay, well, why don't we do that? But I wanted to raise Rene Girard, and he'll be coming up in more videos. And I'll continue to think about your Buddhism illustration, because it's that's a good challenge, and I'll have to look into it.
Yeah. So I guess the last thing I want to say about the challenge is I think you're making a false move if you take Christianity as a given. I think
really.
I think what you need to do
in our culture,
anywhere, I think you need to make a positive argument for Christianity.
Well, I don't disagree with that, but
so don't rely on it being a given. Just say, I'm going to take that off the table, because we can have a whole argument about that, and it's not going to be very productive for what I think, what I really want to hear from you, which is why. Give me a positive reason to latch on to your faith, not just oh well, you're Christian, so you better or else.
I don't think I make that argument.
You don't, but there's a threatening. There's always been a kind of a threatening undertone in some of the, you're going to go to hell if you don't believe, or I think,
have you heard me say that anywhere?
You haven't. But this thing of like, well, you're whatever, you're clearly white and you're from America, so you must be Christian. It's kind of presumptuous, and it's not persuasive to me at all.
Well, I certainly can understand why it's not persuasive, but it's kind of fight. Well, I understand why listening to a Christian minister might trigger that idea, given the way a lot of Christian ministers act. But
well,
I don't get the sense that that's even especially in New England.
Well, I'm from Michigan, remember?
What's that?
I'm from Michigan, remember?
Oh yeah, okay. That's true, anyway, Western Michigan.
yeah. But no, but my point is, Paul, is if you can't make if the positive argument isn't sufficient, I mean, I don't find the whole enterprise to me just doesn't seem credible.
Well, I don't find people become Christian because of arguments, generally speaking.
When I say argument, I mean it in the sort of the Miltonic sense, justify the ways of God to men. Do you want me to get out Paradise Lost and recite the first?
Justify the ways of God to me? That's a bad approach. Try it with just about any other human being. That conversation doesn't go well.
No. But I was talking about the way that Milton structures his epic. I mean, have you read Paradise Lost?
No.
Oh. God, you should read.
I know. I've actually got it on audiobook, and I want to. And I started it, but
I don't believe any of that stuff, and I think he's a freaking genius. It's amazing. No, so he structures his epic is an argument for Christianity.
Yeah. Right.
So it's not. I'm not saying that our faith is the intellectual argument. I'm saying that you have to elaborate it at that level, or else it's just a muddle. You know what I mean? I mean, it has deeper roots, but if it can't get up to the level of I see it, it's clear in an argument, then what are you saying? What are you doing other than asserting? And why should I believe your assertion?
I agree, but again, when I think about how people work, that's usually not why they believe what they believe.
Well, yeah, but people believe all sorts of things.
Yeah, they do.
Doesn't mean it's wise.
That's true.
So again, assertion, belief, these aren't standards that lead us to wisdom. Now, neither is just a completely hyper intellectuality. It's got to be integrated through the whole body up to top to bottom.
Well, I'm curious what you want from it. Now, you just mentioned wisdom. So what are you looking for from? I mean, when you think about Christianity, are you thinking about a system of belief? Are you thinking about rituals? Are you thinking about a morality? Are you thinking about a narrative within which to live? What are you thinking about?
So my big concern here is I think that the intellectual part of Christianity has been failing for a while. It's been in the process of failing ever since the Copernican revolution.
Can you be more specific?
Well, the whole cosmology, it goes back to Dante, is dead. Nobody believes that, the devil lives in the middle of the earth and there's the heavens above and there's angels, and that isn't, you don't look up at the stars and think there's angels there. You think, well, there's galaxies that, move in these elliptical orbits. All of that cosmology is gone. And the intellectual structures that were tightly integrated with all of that back in the medieval period, and this is what makes a powerful worldview. They're split apart.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big problem.
Oh yeah, I agree, and that's something I'm very interested in.
And I'm worried that if we don't get urgent about climate change and maybe nuclear war, that there may not be any of us here in a century or two. And at that point, like, what is all this history worth? What is what we're doing worth if all of my grandchildren are dead?
Well, you nicely articulated the meaning crisis.
Yes. So my concern is that intellectually Christianity doesn't have what it takes to deal with these things. That it's got pieces that we need to remember, right? Because it did have a very powerful cosmology and a powerful ethical statement to make to the world, and an important piece of world history that we have to remember and we have to respect. But does it have what we need now in order to move into the future? And my feeling is, based on the things I've read and the things I've thought about and experiences I've had, is I'm skeptical that it does. It can't be ignored, but I'm not sure it's the whole story.
What would you like the thing you're looking for to afford you?
I want it to afford me it needs to provide consilience for all of these threads.
Define that for me. What do you mean by consilience?
All these things together in an encompassing vision that has not just, it needs to work intellectually, but it also, you need to then connect down to these other levels that are actually pretty well established in Christianity. You've got the iconography and you've got rituals, so if you can work out what's failing, I think, intellectually, and then tie it to all of these traditional things and sort of renew them, for the present, you could then go out and make an argument socially that the solution to our problems is to start with this new renewing the good news for the the present, and the kind of concerns that I think go back to what's happened, this rupture that's happened with science, but also something like what Greta Thunberg is worried about. You could connect to that and not just have this reactionary, like, oh, she's a mentally ill 16-year-old.
Well, and now, of course, the segment of Christianity that tends to get a lot of attention and reaction against climate change, there's, especially in New England, you can find UU churches on every corner in many New England towns that will have rainbow flags and deep.
Well, remember, Paul, I actually did go to a church for a couple of years when I was a kid, and it was Fountain Street.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So Fountain Street, in many ways, would would be at least in alignment with you in terms of some of your concerns. But I'm very interested in the role that let's say a compelling religion would would a role that a compelling religion would play in your life. Would this religion provide consolation? Would this I mean, what, again, I'm very
Well,
curious how, if you found such a religion, how would it change how you think, how you behave, who you are, and how you see yourself?
well, Paul, I mean, I'm not really thinking about this so much for myself. I mean, I think my temperament and my experience makes me kind of an outlier as far as how I engage with society. I'm thinking about this more in terms of the whole of society, right? Like me personally, this, like I
You
live
don't
in,
need it. Is that what you're saying?
no, I deal with things on my own terms. So if if I want to come to terms with the world, I'm gonna find my own way. I'm worried about what the whole of how the whole society is going to manage this, and I think that something needs to be articulated publicly that solves these sort of all of these contradictions that have accumulated that everybody feels like are impossible to deal with.
But I'm interested in the fact that, I mean, you sort of nicely articulated the underpinning assumed religion of a great many people, that, well, the way I view the world is satisfactory, but it's all these other people, maybe those who are complaining about Greta and climate change. These are the people that need to be changed and convinced. But and the implicit in that is sort of, I want them all to see things my way.
No, well, I mean, yes, but no, I want them to, I want the society as a whole to see things in a way that's going to move the society forward.
Okay, but what do you mean by forward? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Look at how we're stuck in so many ways. We're and I feel often like our entire, social reality is papered over with comfortable lies. You know, I mean, it's so obvious in the political sphere, right? Like we can go on and on about that. It's just, redolent with bullshit. How
But
do you
now,
do
but
that?
now, obviously, two disagreeing, conflicting factions define forward in a different way, and so for, let's say,
Yeah,
the kinds of groups
and this
that,
is what religion gives us. It gives us a framework that we can all then kind of uh, that gives us the same sense of where we're going, even if there are sort of variations within it. It 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 it, it keeps these contradictions from being from sort of manifesting into neuroses or psychoses.
if I had a religion that compelled you to believe that climate change was an illusion, would that be attractive to you?
I mean, if my concern is that if you did, and we just kept chugging along, the catastrophes would pile up and we'd all be dead.
So climate change is a real belief. It's I mean, this is something that's
It's
deep.
not a belief. I'm worried. I'm
Oh,
worried
so
about
it's
the
it's an
future. I,
anxiety.
I believe that the sun's going to come up tomorrow. Is it? Maybe not. I mean, like I don't want to get too deep into what can be known, what can't be known. I think there's plenty of evidence out there that there's a problem, and that if we look at it in terms of risk, that the high end of the worst variant in that risk bubble is just going to be absolute calamity. So maybe that doesn't happen. I'm not saying it will. I'm saying I look at the risks, and again, my job, I work as a project manager, so I'm always thinking about, well, what are all the contingencies I have to deal with? How do I get ahead of them? How do I manage them so that the worst thing that could happen, I've at least hedged against it some way. And I look at this problem as it's mostly a practical problem, and if I look at it in that way, it's like, well, Jesus Christ, I mean, the worst thing that could happen is pretty freaking bad. And if we're just complacently going to ignore that risk, like, who the hell are we? What
Well,
are we
the
about?
question is there a we? I mean, that's the question, and it seems like you're looking for a religion that will help found a we that can be productive, but it doesn't sound to me like you're looking for anything to challenge or rearrange the way you see the world now. So in other words, it's sort of a religion to convince those who don't see the world like you in order to mobilize the world. I mean, and this in the way that towards the anxieties and the threats that you see it. And this is again what I hear beneath many of the calls for from mostly secularists, non-theists, for some sort of new religion. And what I usually hear under that is we need something that will move those people who disagree with us to agree with us so we can mobilize the resources of humanity in the direction of addressing the anxieties that I have about the future of the world. That's what I hear.
Well, Paul, the thing is, I'm not really motivated by my beliefs intrinsically. I'm motivated by my curiosity.
I don't understand that from your challenge. I understand that you're much more.
That's because I've been curious for a long time, and I have a lot of things to say that I've seen that inform my perspective on things. But fundamentally, I'm willing to be led wherever, and I'm not going to suspend my judgment, right? But this is why I'm asking you, articulate a theology. I want to hear it. I'm interested. You can tell me as much about it as you want, and I will listen. I will ask you questions. Some of the questions are going to be, well, tell me more about that because that's interesting. Some of them will be like, I don't believe that because of facts X, Y, Z, whatever, right?
So what parts of a potential worldview or religion are you curious about?
Anything. Just lay it on.
Well, that's a little too broad for me. I'd like a little bit more direction.
Well,
I mean, for example, one question might be: is there a reason? Is there a final cause for why you exist?
So
something you're curious about?
Well, that would get into my ideas about the sort of the bias we have towards functionality in our ideas, which I have a definite opinion about, but it would take a while for me to lay out why I think that kind of thinking is has some problems in it.
But because the reason I ask is that this idea of, I mean, you articulated, and quite rightly so. I mean, Christians have been, when the scientific, the shift in, C.S. Lewis writes about this in his book, The Discarded Image, which might be a book that interests you because it's deeply literary. And the book is very much, it's just a little book, very much about this question that the medieval worldview had this incredible model that it basically developed from the classical world, where there's these spheres and God is in a
beautiful vision of the world. It really is.
Right. And Lewis laments the loss of that vision, because what that vision afforded was even, meaning that went all the way down that, and I think probably both of us can agree that meaning afforded tremendous resilience and strength against the normal pervasive suffering that people did throughout the Middle Ages. And so it was an incredibly powerful worldview. And with the coming of the modern period, that image was not just discarded, but destroyed. And with its destruction came the loss of the affordance of that buffer against suffering and buffer against anxiety.
Yes, I'm with you on all of that. I guess the question, what I'd like to hear from you, and I think we should move on to the next topic after this, is lay out for me a theological case about how we reconcile these things, the science that has split off, these concerns about the future, and also all of these other cultures that there's people out there that have had rich experience in these completely other visions of the world. How do we reconcile all that into a Christian story that moves us, that allows us to stand here today and look into the future. And,
I-
and,
I'm
and make it a theological point of view.
okay. What do you mean by theological?
Okay, well, tell me about Revelation. Tell me about the resurrection. Tell me about, the crucifixion and the passion. Tell me about the second coming. Lay it out. Give me the doctrine. No one else, no one else who's arguing from an agnostic, atheist point of view is going to ask you this, but I'm asking you.
Oh, well, thank you. I would say we are made for glory.
Well,
Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what glory is?
Well, I know what the word means.
Okay.
You got to put it in context.
Okay. I would assert that you are made to realize your potential to interact with this world in ways that bring flourishing, not just to you, but to your neighbors. That's what you are made for.
Mm-hmm.
And so you begin to taste that. You taste that as a father. You taste that as a manager. You taste that when you're working in the kitchen. You taste that if you're working in the garden. You taste that if you're having a satisfying and productive conversation with someone. That you are made to take the raw material of humanity and turn rain and soil and grapes into wine. Yeah. I would say that that's what you are made for, and you are made to do this in an everlasting way.
So the task for you, Paul, is going to be to say, how does glory relate to the heat death of the universe?
Well, I think.
Okay, I really wanted to get into some other things. So
okay,
what I'd like you to do is.
Well, you wanted me to lay out a pretty big thing.
No. Well, this is why I'm saying take your time. You don't need to give it to, it doesn't need to be an offhand comment. It doesn't need to be one video. I think, think through these things systematically and then give a presentation. And the other thing you could do that I think would be interesting for me and maybe for your listeners is go back to, when you first started thinking for yourself, when you were a teenager or whatever, and chart, how you arrived at some of these insights and feelings that are connected to this theology as your own faith journey. Mm-hmm. I think that would be, if you could tie all that together in a series of videos or whatever on your own terms, I think it would lay out a lot of the things that you've been kind of moving around peripherally in a very substantial way.
Okay. Well, that's helpful because it's helpful. I think if you listen to me in the Frame of Frames video, I think a lot of the when I look at who watches my videos, or when I can get in some understanding of who watches my videos, when obviously the church work videos that I do probably have more of this, but they tend to be briefer because church work is so much more of a serial enterprise. But I appreciate the request, and it's a good request. But there's a reason that I wanted to start with glory as I did, and because I think, see, the question when being asked to disclose a worldview is always, where do you begin? And so in my experience as a pastor,
that's a choice that you have to make.
No, I know. But when as a pastor, when I begin, I usually begin with an individual and I begin with an audience, because that's very helpful in terms of picking where to begin.
Think about it in terms of those videos John Vervaeke has been making, right? He's laying out a program. So I think it's high time you do something like that too.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, I want to move on to my own stuff now because
I
have a lot to say.
Okay.
So are you aware of the hard problem of consciousness?
Yes.
Okay, so this is this idea that we have a set of experience, like we have physical stuff going on in the brain, right? But that correlates with these experiences that are sort of incommensurable with the actual physical activity that we're seeing.
Right, mind and matter.
Yeah, mind and matter, but they try to make it a lot more specific, right? They qualify it, but yeah, essentially, why is there this free floating I don't know, non-material thing kind of out there, and then suddenly it attaches itself to a brain like a virus, and then, you know, starts orchestrating what the matter's doing, right? And more importantly, it has experience that isn't transparent to whatever the physical thing is doing. I mean, they're connected somehow, but we don't know how, right? Okay, so I realized that there's actually two problems here that are separate. One is the question of subjectivity. So part of why my experience is sort of ineffable is because I'm a subject and I'm in an objective world. It's all this, you know, physical stuff lying around. There's all these physical objects. I'm a subject within it. My experience expressed through my subjectivity is the thing that we can't map or posit causes between when this sort of objective material world. That's the first problem. The second problem is something I've observed that I don't think anybody else has, and I call it, it's a question of form. So I devised this thought experiment or test that I call the magic triangle test. So I want to imagine you're in a classroom and the professor draws. Hold on, I gotta get this. I'll be right back. Sorry.
You broke up a little bit. You said the magic triangle test, and so I didn't hear much after that.
Test. So I want you to imagine you're sitting in a classroom, professor draws a triangle on the chalkboard. So you're like, oh, triangle. Okay, I get it. Now, some point later, you know, let's say a year later, you're thinking about that day or whatever, or just that image pops in your head, a triangle, oh, triangle, right? And for some reason, you get a sheet of paper and you draw a triangle. Now, I want you to imagine through that whole year, now this obviously isn't going to happen, but that whole year, there's an apparatus that's been glued to your head that transcribes every single blip of activity in your brain, records it, and you know, shows exactly what the correlates are to that, you know, the triangle that you saw, the triangle that you imagined, and the triangle that you drew on the sheet of paper, right? Now, what's really weird here is there was a physical form where the triangle was. It disappeared out of existence. So there's no triangle in your head, right? You're not drawing a triangle with neurons to get the triangle, right? Something else is happening. And then suddenly, at some arbitrary distance in time and space, a triangle appeared in your imagination, and then it reappeared physically. In other words, the triangle was over here, and it became a physical object over here. And there was an arbitrary distance in time and space to mediate between them. How did that happen? It's a magician's trick. You put the rabbit in the hat, you look around the hat, there's no rabbit. The magician goes out, the rabbit comes back. Where did the rabbit go?
Is this something analogous to Plato's forms?
Well, I don't want to get into that. That's another topic.
Okay.
But it's a problem, right? There's a physical thing over here that has a structure, a clearly identified
and somehow you imagine to create a representation in your mind.
And then somehow
you can recognize that representation out in the world again.
Yeah, and then the structure, well, not only, well, you could recognize it, but you could also recreate it. So the structure was able to transfer itself through time and space, you know, without any physical laws.
Right.
Right?
Which is very much connected to the mind problem. Because we have in this world around us, you know, we live in the age of decay where you create a triangle out of something and it probably will decay one way or another. But mind, you know, our bodies age, but our self-representation and conception of ourselves in our mind is not. Mind somehow is separate from the decay that is below.
Well, okay, I'm going to say one more thing about that, then we're going to move back to the problem of subjectivity. So
okay.
The only systems in which this is possible are electrical systems. In a physical system, you could see systems that replicate themselves. So we've got living creatures, but we also have things like viruses that are kind of not living. Right. They don't have metabolism. You also get crystals. Crystals self-replicate. There are chemical processes that are self-replicating, right? You also get things like waves, right? Waves in the ocean, waves in the air. So there are kind of like self-replicating processes that propagate through nature, but they only do so through adjacency. It's only with electrical systems where there's some sort of mediation through an electrical process that you can get these arbitrary mediations through time and space.
It's interesting.
That's fucking weird, right? Who talks about that? Nobody. No one looked into this. It's not a topic of discussion. Why is that? Well, nobody seems to like actually think about this as something that needs to be studied. Okay, so I'm going to table that. I have lots of ideas about that, but they're not as well developed. And you really have to start to get into like what's happening in a neuron to understand it.
Okay.
I'm like a quarter of the way there.
Okay.
Okay, so let's go back to the problem of subjectivity. So one problem we have with this claim about subjectivity is ineffable is nobody actually bothers to go and define what they mean by subjectivity. They never give a rigorous definition of what is a subject and what is an object. You know, science is all about, well, let's make everything more objective. But okay, what is an object? Like, give me an axiom that allows me then to go out into the world and say, well, that's an object and that's a subject, right? Now, we do use these terms in a number of fields where they do actually have a fairly clear, reserved definition. So in linguistics, you know, subject and objects are clause level syntactic functions, right? In psychology, I mean, we kind of have an idea of what subject and object are when we're talking about perception, right? Like, I'm a subject, that thing's an object, the sensory input, you know, of objects into the subject. But we don't, if we're going to start talking about, well, what is consciousness in a general sense, we actually need a definition of subject and object that place it in that larger context. So maybe it's perceptual, but then you have to say, well, okay, what is corresponding to the subject and the object out of the physical world or out of some other domain so that there's a correspondence there? Nobody ever actually does that, right? They just say, well, there's qualia and, you know, the subjective is ineffable and we don't know what the connection is. Okay, so I'm going to offer a definition.
Okay.
This is my definition. Let's take three entities. I'm not going to say what they are. They could be a process, just three entities. They're in a bounded dynamic, some kind of interactive dynamic that's physical, and it's bounded in space and time, right? So we're not talking about, you know, all of space and all of time. We're going to limit it to some bounded dynamic. Okay, so if, and we're going to call the entities A, B, and C. So if A interacts with B and A interacts with C, but B and C don't interact within that bounded dynamic, then C is a subject of A with respect to B, and vice versa. If A interacts with B, A interacts with C, and B interacts with C, so they're all interacting together within that bounded dynamic, then B and C are objects with respect to each other, with objects of A with respect to each other. And then you could flip it around too, right? In that case. You follow me? Now, clearly, this happens. Things interact in an asymmetrical way.
Yeah.
If you create a bounded dynamic, not every piece of the thing is going to interact with each other. So you could actually start to mark, if you put in boundaries and start to measure these things, you could mark what's interacting, what isn't, and then show how there's these asymmetries developing, right? So it's a fairly commonsensical idea, and I think it really tracks with what our sort of naive intuitions of what we mean when we say subject and object.
Now, in there, my questions would revolve around what you mean by interacts with, because we're
talking about physical systems here.
Yeah, I know. But there is, I mean, and when we use the word subject, I mean, these words have, you know, especially with your background, so on one hand, the subject is usually subject and object, so we're using that word in that frame. But if you're, let's say, using a political royal metaphor, you know, subject has, he is subject
Well,
to.
these are pretty well. I mean, you get the same type of thing happening with a lot of very root concepts. So like time, you know, you get time, you use all sorts of different, space.
Right.
There's all sorts of these sort of different inflections of very basic concepts. So what I'm saying is, I think when we start to talk about consciousness and about physics and things like that, that we can develop a reserved term under these definitions that works for that kind of scope of interest. And without necessarily impinging upon, say, the reserved use that we have in linguistics. Also, I think we can say that they're connected. They're related. There's a conceptual content there that it doesn't translate specifically, but it's related, and that's the reason why we're using these terms in these different contexts, because there's a sort of a naive, primitive something going on there that is then sprouting into these very technical uses.
Well, I don't know if I mean, you could say naive and primitive. You could also say root sense of it that
I
is
like
being
primitive
expressed.
because there's a lot of, I actually think of them as primitives. They're primitive concepts. So in other words, they kind of push us in a direction, but they're not like nailed down. And you have to start there. Like you really need primitives in your technical vocabulary, because it's the only way to get from someone who has no understanding of anything to kind of get into the right region to then start to define exactly what you're getting to.
Yeah.
So
Now let me see if I get your equation right, because I was taking notes as you were writing. If A to B and A to C, so then you've got A to B and A to C, then C is a subject to A.
But wait, no, but not C to B.
Right, but not C to B.
Then C is a subject of A with respect to B.
And C is a subject to A with respect to B.
And vice versa, actually. But usually you're worried. The one thing you have to consider is that you're really only worried, you really only can take up one interaction at a time when you're talking about this.
Right.
So they're both subjects, but when we talk about a subject, you can only deal with the one relation at a time. You can't deal with the whole system.
Yeah, I got the words laid out, but it hasn't really clicked imaginatively in terms of, I think, what you're trying to get at for me.
So think about it as if you have a bounded system, things are not interacting in a completely symmetrical way.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So there are implications to this, though, that are profound. That you have to, if you start to think about it, it opens up a whole door. So one, it's relative, right? So
right.
One thing's object is another thing's subject, or whatever, right? Because there's more. You could have more than three entities in the bounded dynamic.
Right.
Right. So one thing could be an object to like five, but then this one's excluded. So if I compare to these two, then it's a subject.
When you say C is a subject to A, can you flesh that out or give me an illustration of that? That would make it more real to me.
Let's do it in terms of perception, where we're kind of used to thinking about these things. So I'm in this room. There's a lamp here, right? And then I can see a chair over there.
Okay.
The lamp can't see the chair can't see the lamp.
Right. To the best of your knowledge.
Well, there's like a door here with a window. See? So the angle isn't right for the lamp to see the chair, or vice versa, right? So the lamp is a subject of me. The chair is a subject to me because I can see it, but they can't see each other.
Now, when you say that they're a subject to you, I'm just curious what the importance of that is, what that relationship looks like.
Well, it's some kind of interaction, right? Now, the difficulty here is I'm specifying this without scale. So we could be talking about atoms, or we could be talking about soccer games, or we could be talking about galaxies.
Right.
And I'm also saying it's a bounded dynamic in time and space. So time and space have a lot of different ways of organizing.
Yes.
Right? They're very rich in structure, in ways sometimes I don't think that the physical sciences fully appreciate. So this is neutral about the mode of organization. It's just saying some interaction. We'll leave it to, because we're dealing at a very low level of concept here. So later we can specify, this interaction in a subjective context does this. But what I'm doing is I'm setting up a way of classifying entities that are in dynamics that tells us that there's these asymmetries in the way that they're interacting.
I very much understand the asymmetry in your example, especially because in your example, you are, human being is an incredibly powerful agent. And I thought, when you're talking about subjectivity, and maybe the initial frame is making it more difficult for me to understand your assertion here. But because when we're talking about the difficulty of subjectivity, that seems to have a lot to deal with agency, perception, perspective. Part of subjectivity seems to me to be about each subject is a little center of the world.
Okay. So let's move on to the next point.
Okay.
This is where it starts to get you become amazed that no one noticed this before. So let's talk about perspective.
I like being amazed.
Let's talk about perspective. So typically we assume that perspective is a function of our perception, right? That's the general assumption. And no one ever really interrogates that assumption. So let's set aside for a moment the idea that space has 3 dimensions. Let's just set that aside. Clearly, there's a model there that has some utility, but let's set it aside for a moment and look at perspective as a physical phenomenon. So I want you to imagine that you are in Nebraska and you're looking down a long straight road on a flat plain, right? It goes out way out to the horizon. There's yellow lines on the road. Now, you can assume that the road is probably the same distance across all the way down. There's variations, but they're minimal, right? It's a state highway, shoulders all the same. It's Nebraska, everything's straight. There's no turns, right? You got it? Okay. So as you look out at that highway, do the parallel lines stay parallel?
It depends, obviously, on your...
No. When you look at the line, in your experience...
Oh, in your experience.
In your experience.
Phenomenologically, do they look parallel?
Just empirically, are they parallel? No. They converge, right? Okay. Now I want you to imagine there's a person out there, right? That's maybe half a mile down the road. So they're small. They're small. You can see them. And they're smaller than they would be if they were right in front of you.
Right.
And their lines, if there was any length there, their lines would converge, right?
Right.
So you say, oh, well, that's just in my perspective, right?
Right.
Now I want you to imagine that you're that person looking back at you. Are you bigger to them? No, you're small.
Right.
In fact, you're just as small to them as they are to you.
Right. Because we, in a sense, mentally create this, Go ahead. Okay.
Do we mentally create it? Where's the evidence that this is cognitively susceptible? Is it a projection of our brains? Are we doing something cognitively to create this? If so, what? Show me the process that's generating that effect.
Well, what's interesting is if you look at these psychological tests, when you've got the classic one where you've got the wide cup and the narrow cup, and you ask a child which one holds more liquid.
Judgment, though. That's a judgment. That's not an actual percept.
Yeah, but isn't in some ways the question, if you're asking a question about what, I would, like, what I'm saying here is basically, I would imagine it would be, in other words, the knowledge that, that is not in fact a tiny person, but that is potentially a person the same size as myself. That is a learned judgment and not necessarily a naive perception.
Well, okay, so here's a question.
And I don't know that we can pull that apart.
So if that's the case, if it's just if this is just a percept, then clearly when we take a photograph of something, it should be as big as it would be if it were right in front of our face. Is that the case?
What I'm saying is that, in a
No,
sense,
no, I'm serious. We can take a physical record of perspective in exactly the way that we experience it.
right. But what I'm saying is that all of this processing that we do, that we are not aware of,
But is this
creates
processing?
what we think that thing we are looking at is. And we have this all the time when we look at things and we don't recognize them. The fact that I see that as a person is a function of this filter that we have just so mindlessly used to see the world through.
You're assuming that it's processing. For instance,
Oh yeah, I'm assuming that.
But wait, if that person sees me in the same proportion that I see him, like our brains aren't connected. We're not, processing can go way haywire, right? But there's a mathematical, it's locked down mathematically what the proportions are in relation to each other out in space. And we can record physical memorializations of that exact relationship. It's not processed. Your processing is making judgments. You're making a representation of what's going on in space. So you can make judgments about it, and your judgments can do things like create three-dimensional space. But your actual orientation as a subject is actually to deal with the world this way.
But everything I see is the product of a process. And everything that appears to me in my mind is the product of a process. And we know this because, for example, when my mother-in-law, she was, having some health issues and she was heading towards a stroke, she began to, we call them hallucinations, but she was seeing people, and she came over and visited my house, and she said to my wife, I don't understand how Paul lets all those people live in the backyard. Now, the question is, what was she seeing? And when we would get into detail about what she was seeing things, but there was a great deal of processing going on. And to assume that when I, who am not having these brain issues, look down a road in Nebraska and see something, it doesn't mean that I am seeing it simply or purely, but there's just as much processing going on that builds into that picture and that experience that I have.
My point is that perspective has a stability that can't be explained merely through processing, because there's too many people that can do the same exact thing, and there's just physical equipment that can do the same, that can register these perspective structures. If you're hallucinating, it's not like, your judgment can be off, but the underlying thing that you're representing is still there. And representations have to share some features with the thing they're representing. Otherwise, they're just arbitrary. And if they're arbitrary, who and how are the representations being drafted? So the question is, how do the representations that we're drafting, what features do they share with the thing that are being represented? Because when you hit that, you've hit not just the representation as a construct, you've hit what the representation is actually telling us about the world.
Okay, I think I understand where you're going. I've obviously, so
the subject, the perspective organizes around the subject. It is direct evidence that the subject is out there in space. Because you know what perspective tells me? And when I'm at the perspective point, everything out there is relating to me uniquely, in the way that the perspective is structuring my relations to it. And it's doing it in a way that's it's exactly proportional to the things that they're seeing about me that are subjective to them. So the whole system actually is tracking in a very integrated manner, right? So it's not like I see a mile and you see a half a mile. We're all seeing the same mile, but the mile is organizing itself with respect to us through perspective.
I'm not sure the mile is organizing itself, but I think more so that you are in fact organizing your perspective of the mile, and each subject does that.
Yeah, but not through representation.
I think representation is exactly how it's organizing mentally the perception of the mile.
In your cognition, but not in your body.
You see, I guess, you know, a good part of my work has been recognizing the fact that so many of these imaginative constructs, in fact, are made from a subjective, usually an imaginary subjective position.
But this isn't imaginary. This is what I'm saying is perspective isn't imaginary. The fact that we're self-consciously analyzing perspective and then making judgments about it does involve our imagination. But the basic construct, if you want to get away from, you know, the sort of intellectual thing that you're trying to parse in the construct, is it's out there in the world.
But my point is, we can't know that it's out there in the world without our imagination. Because I mean, that's in a sense the definition of a subject.
But I guess what I'm getting at here is if you go back to my definition of the subject, you don't need cognition for that. It's just a function of interaction.
See, and I'm deeply skeptical about that.
Well, I realize you would be, but if you take the definition, if you follow the definition out logically, you don't need to have cognition. You don't need things that are living. It's a relative concept, so it depends on kind of what bounded frame you put it in, right? Yeah, so those and then if we look at perspective, we are not able to. You can't. I've seen no evidence that your cognition, what's going on in your brain, the way that the brain works, is generating perspective itself. We can generate judgments about perspective, but we're not generating the vanishing point. We're not generating the perspective point. We're not generating the convergence of two lines, because if we could manipulate it consciously, and we can't.
No, I think you're greatly overestimating the capacity of what we can consciously manipulate in terms of our perceptions. Because the thing is, I can't see, now you and I can have a degree of agreement about a whole bunch of things with respect to, let's say, perspective on a Nebraska road, but there's a fair amount of limitation between that, and I arrive at this basically having spent a lot of time talking to a good number of pretty crazy people, or people that I regard as crazy, and these aren't just perspectives in terms of simple perception, and so this is why when we're talking about subjectivity and what we mean by it, I'm a little skeptical about the easy ways that we can do this apart from creating some sort of an imaginative framework by which we usually mathematically sketch out a world and agree that we're both working in it. And that's a tremendously powerful thing, but how that relates to subjectivity, I'm skeptical.
Well, let's go through two other bits. So the question is why is there then three-dimensional space? Like, why is that a construct that seems to be very highly functional? Well, there's not just subjects, right? We talked about there's objects as well, right? Like if things start to interact with, everything's interacting with each other, there's an object. So how do we, if I'm just looking at everything subjectively, how do we chart what's an object if I know there's another perspective over it? And I know all these things have their own perspective.
Well, I think the real question is how we do that together.
Listen.
Multiple subjects.
This is what Cartesian space does, actually. So let's posit that there's two subjects that have perspectives that are intersecting. We're going to pull ourselves out of our own subjective. We're going to step back a little bit and create a representation of two subjects that their their perspective structures are interacting. And we're going to say that there's a point where they interact. We're going to pick out one point, and that the intersection between those two are orthogonal, right?
Mhm.
And then we're going to say, well, okay, now we have a field across an image or like a piece of paper or a screen. We've got a field where there are an infinite number of these intersections possible. That gives you length and width, right? A comma B. But then you also need to account for the fact that you've pulled yourself out of the scene and you're creating a representation. This is how we get depth. So from me, the representer, to the field that is my representation of the two perspectives, I've got another intersecting point. So notice that length and width are always interchangeable, but depth is not. The two perspectives I'm modeling they're equal to me, basically. I'm just looking at how they interact with each other. But the depth, the connection that I have with it as the representer, it has a different character.
Mhm.
And also things are occluded from me within depth that aren't occluded from me in length and width. I can only see length and width. I can't see the other side of an object because I'm creating a representation. So representations necessarily have things that are clear and things that are opaque.
Mhm.
So there's space. And why there are 3 dimensions. You
Okay.
build up from the subject. Now the subject, oh, this is the last thing I forgot to mention. The subject has a lower order of contingency. And I'll talk about that in a moment, a lower order of contingency than the object. So if I take A, B, and C, right, and I say, well, A relates to B, A relates to C, but B doesn't relate to C, and I say, well, let's forget about C. Is my relation between A and B the same, whatever's happening with C, whether or not C is interacting with B or not? And it is, right? So a subjective connection always holds true, regardless of whatever a third entity is doing. But objective connection, an object needs to have a third term in order to determine it as an object. So when we talk about subjectivity, subjectivity has to be a construct first before there can be objectivity.
Right. In many ways, objectivity is dependent upon subjectivity.
Exactly. This is what scientists get wrong.
I agree.
So I want to go over one more concept, and then we can maybe have a general discussion and then wrap this up in
Okay.
15 minutes. So this last concept I want to get across to you is this idea of order of contingency. So if I take an event or an entity or some thing that I'm looking at, or process or whatever, if it has no priors, if you don't need anything for it to be possible, it has a first order of contingency. So I'll give it, and then if it needs one thing to happen before it, it has a second order of contingency. Right? Now, we're not going to look at this in the universal sense, because then it's just madness. But we're going to look at it in a kind of a bounded sense. So I'll give you an example. Before we started this, if I wanted to talk to you, I had to open the computer up, right? And then I had to do something to start the program, and then we could talk. It doesn't go the other way around. I didn't talk to you in order to open up the program, in order to open the computer up. I had to have opened the computer up. That had to be something I did, or that had to be possible before I could do the other steps. But they're not causally related. They could be. We could think about this in terms of causation, but not necessarily. It could be something that just a condition that needs to be possible in order for the next thing to happen. Right?
Okay.
Okay. So it's important then when we start thinking about things like cognition, does cognition have a first order of contingency, or does it have some later order of contingency? And if it has a later order of contingency, we have to determine what's prior, what's more basic, and what makes it possible. I would contend that when we're looking at a schema of consciousness and, in a human being, or at kind of the scale that we're dealing with, that actually, just even within cognition, consciousness has a kind of a third order of contingency, because it's linear. It only focuses on one thing at a time. It's functional. It's always looking for causes. So it has a kind of a third order of contingency, whereas you get other things that are happening, that are more basic than consciousness, just in cognition. But cognition itself, where you need a representation, you have to have an interpretant. If you have a sign, you have an interpretant, you have a medium, and you have a reference. Well, that's three entities. You have to have three things involved there in order for it to work. So if I'm going to talk about that as a construct, it has a higher order of contingency than something that's just self-sufficient. So what is the thing that's self-sufficient, or what's the thing that's binary? So
observation.
Observation.
See, but I think that's part of the. I think that's actually what modernism, in a naive way, got wrong.
What?
That observation is so primary in terms of your schema of contingency.
Well, my claim is here with this definition and all of this is that cognition has a fairly high order of contingency. In other words,
yes.
It doesn't matter what you know or what you observe, because there's things that are just going on there that don't care about your knowledge and your little, well, I think it's this, I'm going to write down this about it. They don't care about that. The atoms don't care that we're scribbling equations about them.
Right.
That all of that construct stuff that we're doing with representations, I mean, it connects down, but it doesn't, all of that stuff's going on without us or around us, or it doesn't care about us. Right.
And I agree with that, but it's a very interesting question to ask, how we know that and why we suspect that and why all of us agree to that for the most part.
So here's a weird thing that the intellect does. If all these processes kind of out in the world are moving from sort of a physical, just a really simple physical way of organizing where they're all sort of identical and have the same properties, up into something that's more hierarchically oriented, and then you start to get these cause and effect chains that push time out into linear chains and all of this. The intellect is actually, insofar as it's trying to gain insight, is actually going backwards. So we're starting from imagination, what can I imagine about the world, and trying to move back into, well, what's really happening. And to make it more complicated, that process has the same set of orders of contingencies stacked, from basic to more complicated. So as the intellect gets more complicated in itself, it gets to more basic things that are happening out in the world. So they're going crosswise like this, which is why we get so tripped up when we try to say, well, what's ontology? What's epistemology? What can I know? What is? We get all tripped up because actually what the intellect is doing, and what I don't want to say reality, but what processes are doing outside ourselves or outside of just the body, or even in the body, is going in the opposite direction, right? I mean, this is the conundrum of the intellect. It's also the game of the intellect. It's why it's fascinating, sparks flying, all this stuff. But what I object to is when when there's all this confusion and there's no way of parsing all of these things to get down to ground.
Well, it's very difficult to get down to ground.
It is.
I think partly, if I understood your opposite way analogy that you made, because our ability to productively interact with this shared space in which we inhabit is tremendously complex, but it's in many ways, it's so the processes required to interact with it, even in a naive way, have been so efficiently built into it, have been so sufficiently built into our engagement with it, we don't even recognize the processes are at work. In other words, it's similar to the fact that LeBron James makes basketball look easy.
Yeah, because it's all embodied, right?
It's all embodied, and LeBron James is just such an exceptional human being in so many different ways that he makes basketball look easy, whereas for we're
It doesn't look
the
easy.
glory and the majesty of what he's doing is a sense lost to us by the effortless way in which he.
No, it isn't. That's why people love to watch him. It's like, wow, right?
Well, but
plug into that.
Well, no, but the glory is manifest, but it's in a sense revealed when I get out on the court and my lack of glory. So, but part of, one of my favorite Jordan Peterson quips is with his conversation with Roger Scruton when he talks about the fact that, the theory that he has that what in a sense we're perceiving constantly around us is a series of remembered cartoons. And these remembered cartoons are always getting tweaked a little bit.
Yeah.
Because we have this manifest image that my mind is telling me that I'm sitting in this messy office, focusing on this computer screen, talking to you.
This is what I'm saying, Paul, is consciousness. Everyone wants to, there's this movement afoot to say that consciousness is this like universal metaphysical thing. It's really kind of a pathetic faculty when you get down to it. It never shuts up. It can't just be quiet. It goes only in a straight line. It doesn't know how to encompass some, large manifest world. It's kind of pathetic. And to say that, well, this is the glory of the unifying principle of the universe is ridiculous. It's comical.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, it's kind of like our bodies. If I look at myself and say, that's kind of pathetic, but where would I be without it?
Yeah. What I guess what I'm trying to get with these definitions and stuff, Paul, is that I really think that we overestimate the importance of cognition. Obviously it's important to us in this game that we're playing to come up with ideas is an intellectual game that's in cognition, in consciousness. So
what's more important than it?
Doing is that, but what's beneath it, what makes it all possible isn't that.
Okay, so we say we overemphasize it, but what's more important than it? What more do we have?
The physical world.
Do we have the physical world?
We're participants in the physical world.
Okay. But I would assert that almost everything, in fact, almost the definition of what interests you is, in fact, the relationship between this cognition and the physical world.
Well, that's because I'm an intellectual. It's not because I think that's how the world is constituted.
Well, that's because you're a human being.
Well, exactly. But that little activity, which I find fascinating, which motivates me, I'm not under any illusions that is what the universe is about. If I were, that would be a kind of a profound narcissism.
But now we're back to the religious question, because you said what the universe is about, as if it is about something.
Well, yeah, that's because language is always about something. Language is always referential, right? So I'm always locked into these kind of heuristics when I'm talking, because that's the way language, that's the bias that language has. That's the bias that my consciousness has.
Well, I hear within you a deep nihilism, as opposed to my gloryism that says that.
So I think that consciousness and cognition have a very high order of contingency, which means they're there, they exist, they're important to us, but they're not like universally. They're not universal. They're limited to these sort of goings on that we have here, right? So if you want to get back to the universal, you have to start peeling things back. Now the problem is the further you get away from the little local concerns that we have and through cognition and the mind and all of that, the more you get away from things that you could talk about intelligently.
But what's so interesting me about this is that we began this entire conversation with your anxiety about all these little cognitive people ending.
Well, because I'm one of them. I don't know.
But so what? I mean, the
So,
universe that you just laid out before me basically says, well, we got all this stuff and it's sort of unimportant. So what would be so bad if it all just goes away?
I mean, if you want to talk about galaxies that are way over there, nothing. You don't care about all the people that were killed in the gulags in Russia. You don't
Exactly.
care
So
about
why
what's
be
happening to
worried?
the Uyghurs right
So
now.
I get we come back to this project, and you want me to somehow afford you a schema by which your anxiety is relieved about the imminent death of the universe, but then you turn around and say, but that's the
Well,
moving
this is
around of the dust on this insignificant planet really isn't much at all. But you
well,
don't live like that.
but no, but Paul, the thing is my attitude is that these things that matter to me are localized. They're localized.
Yeah. And that's in fact the definition of a subject. That
Yeah,
that and
exactly.
but then you
Now,
just in a
now
sort
you're
in a
getting to
sense
my
you just sort
pattern
of
thinking.
undermined it and said, but all of this stuff it isn't really that important. And so it's
Well,
like,
it isn't important as we get more objective, as we start to grow the bounds of that dynamic.
and I
Uh,
think that's a part of the problem of the worldview. And I think you expressed that initially with the initial challenge, because you want those problems to be addressed. And I believe you're sincere in wanting them to be addressed, but in a sense now you've turned around and said, but if life on Earth is extinguished, because there's probably not much of it in the universe. So what? And again, I think that has within it an implied perspective, which I think is actually a psychological result of modernism and with the loss of this glorious image that C.S. Lewis uh, um, laments the loss of.
well,
And,
so
and
there's
so I hear within you a deep conflict between these two worlds.
well, I mean, you have a conflict between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, right? Are they one person? Or are they three?
Oh yeah, don't
So
ask me
okay,
to figure that
so
out or to articulate it.
there's one more piece of this, and I don't know if I want to go too deep into this, but I do want to kind of hit on it because I think that you're sensing that you don't know what I you don't have a sense of what I think the unity of everything is. So,
Well, I don't have a sense of the importance of the unity for you.
well, let's track back. So if we start peeling out all these layers of contingency, right? You just start taking them out, right? This is contingent. Well, let's set this aside. This is contingent. Let's set this aside. This is contingent. What what are you left with? You're left with the void. Now, the Buddhists spend a lot of time wandering around in the void, trying to achieve moksha and, get out of samsara and all the Maya in it.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
they're
yeah.
really interested, like, what is in the void? How do we know that the void contains the unity of something? Gets down to whatever the roots of everything is. So, my apprehension of this is that when you peel all that stuff back and you're in the void, and going into the void feels like death. You can't really get into the void unless you are, in a sense, have this like a shamanistic experience of death. It's really the only way that if you really want to get into this and like face it, it's really the only option is you have to kind of experience this sort of death experience. And then when you're there, you if you're lucky, if you're talented enough, if you have the right kind of apprehension, you can get a sense that actually everything is unified. Actually, the world is one, but it isn't a particular thing. It doesn't want anything because it is everything. If everything is one thing, it can't want anything in particular because the moment it wants something in particular, it's just another particular thing.
Right, right.
Right? So it has to be something that's uncharacteristic, non-characteristic.
Right. It has to
And the
be
only
other.
place, well, not even other, because it is us. We are it. It is us. We are it. But it's not characteristic. We can touch it at any point in the universe, but it's not. The touching of it is just another thing in the universe that it consists in, right? So the real beef I have with Christianity is it keeps telling us that thing wants something in particular from us. It has an image, and there's a face up there that's trying to talk to us. And I have trouble with that, because if it is the unity of the universe, it couldn't want anything in particular in some sense, because it just is what is in all of time. All of time is already out there in it.
Right. And that's the difference between pantheism and theism, because in theism the God is other, and fundamentally other from that which is, in the sense of what you're talking about.
Well, so then my point is, yes, there are particular things that are obligations to me, but they're local to me. They're within me. They're within. They are me.
And there's no.
And
But again, this is so
my
fascinating to me, because
my
you want.
particularity is what connects me to the universal that isn't particular.
Right, but this is so divorced from the religion you would like me to provide and convince you with.
I'm just asking you to lay out your precepts. I didn't, because I'm interested, because you're interested, because it's interesting, because I'm driven by my curiosity, not by
I think that's beautiful, and I'm glad you are. But I would love for you to have a metaphysic that could afford that.
I think it would be morally wrong.
But then wouldn't your project also be morally wrong? Because if your metaphysic doesn't afford it,
no,
then it really isn't your metaphysic.
The particularities are afforded by my locality in the fabric of everything that is. It affords me what I am specifically.
I think I'm having fun. I enjoy this. I enjoy this.
All right. I probably actually need to get going here, but we should do this again.
Well, we'll watch the comments. You got a pretty strong reaction the last time. I loved it. I know people. It's so. I love posting things that annoy people. I don't know what's in me. It's my disagreeable nature, I suppose. But we posted your video. I thought, oh, people are going to hate on you, but it's been fun.
Well, I didn't know. I mean, I guess it's because I'm ruffling a lot of people's their core feelings about the world.
Yeah, well, I think that adding that chaos is a good thing for a channel, and I think you're fun to talk to, and even if I find your challenge, I just think it's fun, and so I appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate listening to your perspective. So I will post this. Coming up soon.
Well, Paul, I got to warn you though. You got to start arguing against the things I've said now.
You don't think I've been arguing against what you've said during this video?
No. I mean, in your future videos.
Videos.
This is a different perspective than you're getting from the atheists.
Well, but I think in some ways, in theologically, a lot of what was written in the 19th and early 20th century was called systematic theology, and systematic theology was a very important thing in Western theology for about 100 years. And in some ways, what I'm hearing you ask for is that, and it's very much part and parcel of modernism. Very little systematic theology is written now because most people recognize that that subjects are in themselves put requirements upon form, and so I'll have to think about whether or not I will lay out a systematic approach to this. I think I think I do in fact talk about many of the things that you're asking for, but you asking for it does help me think about how I want to plan videos and some of the topics I want to bring forward.
I think it would be really helpful if you laid out a program. Don't necessarily think.
No, I agree with that. I very much agree with that, and I'm very weak on that.
Like a Hegelian system, but like a program for. It doesn't have to be complete. It just needs to sort of send us in a direction and answer a lot of the issues that are causing contradictions.
Well, I think the simplest program that I can articulate now is one that's not original to me, which is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Now that takes a lot of unpacking because the God word is complicated, but the second part of it, which is love your neighbor as yourself, sounds, again, in our society, deeply impacted with that Bible, my argument is that we are in fact bad lovers of each other, and loving another human being is a tremendously challenging thing to do and tremendously costly. And I think even from this idea, this entire story of Jesus makes sense, but that's not original to me.
Okay. All right.
And
Well,
even
good
at
talk.
Fountain Street, they don't mind loving each other, right?
Don't,
That's all that they're about.
but they also like let Buddhist monks come in and do chants and things.
Oh, all right. That's all right.
They're Unitarians.
Yes. Thank you, Jeff. We
All
will
right.
email back and forth, and I'm sure we'll talk again.
All right. Have a good day.
Okay. Bye-bye.